Britain has made some enormous economic mistakes. Over the past century, a series of self-inflicted wounds transformed the world's largest trading nation into a country where real wages are now lower than they were 18 years ago. That's not a typo, not hyperbole, just a fact that should stop you cold. In 1913, Britain commanded 50% of global capital investment from London. Today, nearly 3/4 of British voters believe things are getting worse, and economic optimism sits at its lowest level since 1978. Some of this decline was inevitable, much of it was not. Start in 1925, with a decision made by one of Britain's most celebrated leaders. On April 28th of that year, Winston Churchill, then serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, announced Britain's return to the gold standard. He pegged the pound at its pre-World War I rate of $4.86. The problem was that this overvalued the pound by roughly 10% compared to where it had been trading on the open market. And Churchill knew he was making a mistake. A month earlier, he'd hosted a dinner attended by both supporters and opponents of the policy, and he openly admitted that John Maynard Keynes, who fiercely opposed the return, provided the better arguments. Behind the scenes, it was Bank of England Governor Montague Norman who had been the most forceful advocate for the return to gold, effectively outflanking the economic objections with establishment pressure. But Churchill concluded that as a matter of practical politics, he had no alternative. Keynes had predicted deflation, unemployment, and domestic unrest, predictions he would later formalize into a broader framework in his landmark 1936 work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, and he was right on all three counts. Roy Jenkins would later call it the gravest mistake of the Baldwin government, and Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard just 6 years later amid the global depression. Fast forward to September 16, 1992. Black Wednesday. Britain had joined the European exchange rate mechanism in 1990, effectively tying the pound's value to the Deutsche Mark, but maintaining that peg required interest rates far too high for the British economy. Prime Minister John Major's government was caught in an impossible bind: defend the peg and strangle growth, or abandon it and suffer the political humiliation. Speculators sensed blood. George Soros had been building a short position against the pound since late 1991, and his bet ballooned to $10 billion. The Bank of England fought desperately, selling over $22 billion in reserves in a matter of hours. In a last-ditch panic, the government announced it would raise interest rates to 15%, though the hike never actually took effect. None of it worked. The pound crashed 25% against the dollar in the weeks that followed. Exchange rate losses hit nearly $5 billion, and Soros walked away with a reported $1 billion in profit, earning the title The Man Who Broke the Bank of England. Norman Tebbit christened the ERM the Eternal Recession Mechanism. Here's the strange irony of Black Wednesday. It may have accidentally been good economic policy. With the pound free-floating, the Bank of England could finally cut interest rates, exports surged, and growth returned. Norman Lamont, the Chancellor who presided over the crisis, later claimed the economic effects were entirely benign, calling it really White Wednesday. But the political damage was catastrophic. The Conservative Party's reputation for economic competence was shattered, contributing directly to their landslide defeat in 1997. Then there's privatization, and specifically two cases where ideology outran common sense. In 1989, England and Wales became the only place on Earth with a fully privatized water and sewage system. No other country has ever done this, and for good reason. Research from the University of Greenwich found that consumers ended up paying £2.3 billion more every year than they would have under public ownership. By 2024, rising inflation and interest rates had left several water companies drowning in unsustainable debt. Thames Water being the most prominent, lurching toward insolvency under a debt pile that had ballooned to nearly £19 billion. Rail privatization, carried out in stages between 1988 and 1997, followed a similarly troubled path. The privatized infrastructure company Railtrack, later replaced by the not-for-profit network Rail after its spectacular collapse in 2001, became a symbol of what went wrong. Private profit extracted from a public asset while maintenance and safety suffered. Even Tory Minister Sir Malcolm Rifkind admitted the chosen model was, in his words, irrational, bad economics and bad business sense. Passenger numbers did increase and rolling stock improved, but these gains were swallowed by failures in infrastructure maintenance, service quality, and above all, cost management. The 2008 financial crisis hit Britain with devastating force. The run on Northern Rock in late 2007 was just the beginning, and what followed was a political choice that would define the next decade. Starting in 2010, the coalition government under David Cameron and Chancellor George Osborne implemented sweeping austerity. The logic seemed straightforward enough. The deficit had hit its highest level since 1946, and there was genuine fear that bond markets could panic, as they were doing across southern Europe. But the Office for Budget Responsibility concluded that austerity reduced GDP growth by 2% between 2010 and 2012 alone. And here's the bitter punchline. Despite years of cuts to public services, public debt actually rose, climbing from 56.6% of GDP in 2009 to 90% by 2013. The medicine was supposed to reduce the debt. Instead, it slowed the economy so severely that the debt grew anyway. The damage from this period extended far beyond the deficit numbers. Britain's productivity growth, which had been running at roughly 2% annually before the financial crisis, collapsed to just 0.3%. The Royal Statistical Society identified this as the single statistic that best captured the decade's biggest issues. If wages had simply continued growing on their pre-crisis trajectory, the average British worker would now be earning an additional £10,700 a year. And then came Brexit. On June 23, 2016, the Leave campaign won the EU membership referendum by 51.9 to 48.1%. Nearly a decade later, the economic verdict is increasingly clear. Goldman Sachs analysis suggests UK GDP sits roughly 6% below where it would have been without Brexit. Investment is 12 to 18% lower, employment is 3 to 4% lower, and productivity has taken a further 3 to 4% hit. Public opinion has shifted dramatically as well. By May 2024, 55% of voters believed leaving the EU was the wrong decision, while the share who thought it was right had fallen from 46% to just 31%. As if Brexit weren't enough, Britain then subjected itself to perhaps the most compressed economic disaster in modern political history. In September 2022, newly installed Prime Minister Liz Truss and Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng unveiled over £50 billion in unfunded tax cuts, overwhelmingly benefiting the wealthy. The market's response was immediate and brutal. Sterling plummeted, government borrowing costs spiked, and the average 5-year mortgage rate surged to 6.51%. The Bank of England was forced into emergency intervention, Kwarteng was sacked, the tax cuts were reversed, and 49 days after taking office, Truss resigned. The estimated cost to the Treasury reached £65 billion, making Black Wednesday's £3.3 billion look almost quaint by comparison. Truss herself has dismissed anyone who blames her for crashing the economy as, in her words, stupid or malevolent. The bond markets appear to disagree. What connects all of these disasters is a pattern. In 1925, Churchill acknowledged the better argument and ignored it. In 1992, the government clung to an unsustainable exchange rate long past the point of reason. Austerity was maintained for years after the evidence showed it was self-defeating. Brexit was pursued without a credible economic plan. The mini-budget was launched without even consulting the Office for Budget Responsibility. Each time, ideology or political expediency overruled economic reality, and each time, ordinary people paid the price. They're still paying it. As of early 2026, unemployment has climbed to 5.2%, with youth unemployment reaching 16%, the highest since 2015. Growth projections for 2026 cite at a dismal 1%. Inflation has averaged over 5% since mid-2021, and planning dysfunction means projects like the Lower Thames Crossing have consumed £800 million just on paperwork, producing planning documents that, stacked on top of each other, would reach the height of the Arc de Triomphe. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has staked his government on reversing some of this damage through infrastructure investment, planning reform, and a reset of trade relations with Europe. But the scale of what's been squandered makes recovery a generational project, not a parliamentary one. Britain was once the world's economic powerhouse, a small island that punched impossibly far above its weight. A century of avoidable mistakes hasn't erased that legacy entirely, but it has left a country where wages haven't grown in nearly 2 decades, where infrastructure crumbles, and where the question is no longer whether decline has happened, but whether it can ever be reversed.